He carried her through waist-deep water, holding her like his own grandmother. It's not every day that an ordinary man does something so powerful, so selfless, that it captures the hearts of millions. But in the fall of 2018, as Hurricane Michael tore through the Florida Panhandle, one man did just that, without ever expecting the world to notice. Jerome Thompson, a 32-year-old construction worker living in Panama City, Florida, was no superhero. He didn't wear a uniform. He wasn't part of any rescue team. In fact, his own trailer home had already taken a beating from violent winds and floodwaters. But when the storm hit hardest and people were desperately trying to escape, Jerome chose to run toward the danger. Hurricane Michael was one of the most powerful storms to ever strike the continental United States. Winds reached a staggering 155 miles per hour, and entire neighborhoods were flattened in hours. Streets turned into rivers. Power lines snapped like twigs, sirens echoed in the distance, and cell phone signals vanished. In the midst of this chaos, Jerome noticed something that made his heart sink. Just across the street, his elderly neighbor's house was quickly disappearing beneath rising floodwater. That house belonged to Miss Lillian Carter, an 84-year-old widow who had lived in the same place for nearly 5 decades. Most of her family had either passed away or moved up north. She had no one nearby, and she wasn't strong enough to get out on her own. Jerome didn't stop to think. He didn't check for cameras. He didn't ask himself whether it was safe. He acted. Grabbing an old raincoat and a flashlight, he waded out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him over. Debris floated by, branches, trash cans, pieces of fences. The water was cold, and it was rising fast. But Jerome kept going, fighting against the current, one step at a time. When he reached Miss Lillian's house, the front door wouldn't budge. It was swollen shut from the water pressure. Without wasting a moment, Jerome kicked the door open with his boot and called out her name. Inside, he found her sitting in a chair, clutching a photo of her late husband, terrified and shivering. "I told her, you're not staying here. I'm getting you out," Jerome later recalled. He wrapped her in a blanket, lifted her gently into his arms, and began the slow, exhausting journey back to dry ground. The water, by now, was nearly up to his chest. With every step, he whispered to her, "You're okay. I've got you." To anyone watching, it looked like something out of a movie. A young black man, soaked and shivering, carrying a fragile white woman through the flood, like she was his own family. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was real. And Jerome wasn't doing it for attention. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. After what felt like forever, Jerome made it to safety. He gently set Miss Lillian down on a porch that had managed to stay dry and covered her with his jacket. They were both exhausted. Neither spoke for a minute. They just looked at each other, two strangers now bonded forever by one powerful moment of courage. It didn't take long for someone to snap a photo of them. Jerome, dripping wet, holding Miss Lillian's hand as she smiled weakly. That image would soon spread across the internet like wildfire. But in that moment, Jerome had no idea. He just knew that he had done something that mattered. And that was only the beginning of the story. What Jerome did next shocked even seasoned first responders, people who had seen the worst and best of humanity during disasters. But even they weren't prepared for the selflessness that would follow one man's heroic act. After carrying Miss Lillian Carter through nearly chest-deep floodwater to safety, Jerome didn't just drop her off and walk away. There were no ambulances nearby, no shelters with space, and very little help on the ground. The neighborhood was still underwater. Streets were blocked. Phone lines were dead. Help wasn't coming anytime soon. So Jerome made a decision most wouldn't even consider. He brought Miss Lillian into his own home. Now, keep in mind, Jerome's home wasn't untouched. His small trailer had lost part of its roof. The inside was soaked from rain. The power had been out for hours. Food was running low. Clean drinking water was scarce. Yet somehow he made it work. He gave Miss Lillian the only bed that wasn't soaked. He found a flashlight and kept it by her side, so she wouldn't be scared at night. He boiled rainwater on a gas stove just to keep her hydrated. And when the nights got cold, he handed her his only blanket, choosing to sleep on the floor in damp clothes just to make sure she was warm and safe. Jerome didn't do it for praise. He didn't do it to be called a hero. He did it because, in his own words, I couldn't let her die in that house. That could have been my grandma. I did what anyone should do. But the truth is, not everyone would have done what Jerome did. Most people would have walked past. Some might have helped her get to a rescue team, but very few would open their homes, especially when their own lives had been turned upside down. Jerome didn't just perform a rescue, he showed the kind of empathy and compassion that changes lives. Miss Lillian, weak and shaken, couldn't stop crying. Not from fear, but from gratitude. She had lost everything: her home, her belongings, even the family photos on the walls. But here was this young man, a neighbor she barely knew, treating her like his own grandmother with respect and dignity. Word started to spread slowly in the neighborhood. Volunteers helping with the cleanup passed the story along. One Red Cross worker even said, "In all my years responding to hurricanes, I've seen people steal, fight, even abandon their own families. But I've never seen anyone like Jerome." Still, Jerome remained humble. While others looked for food handouts or waited for FEMA assistance, he used whatever little he had to care for Miss Lillian. Neighbors began pitching in too. Someone dropped off a pack of canned food, another brought bottled water. Jerome's actions were creating a ripple effect. His kindness was contagious. Miss Lillian later told a local reporter, "He saved more than my life. He saved my faith in people." The story of a black man rescuing and sheltering an elderly white woman during one of the worst hurricanes in U.S. history wasn't just heartwarming, it was powerful. It was healing. And it was exactly the kind of story people needed in a world so often divided by race, age, and fear. But Jerome didn't know any of that. He wasn't watching the news. He wasn't online. He was just doing what he felt was right. What he didn't realize was that his quiet act of humanity was about to become a national story, and that it would change his life in ways he never imagined. Sometimes, a single photo can say more than 1,000 words. And for Jerome Thompson, that one moment captured by candlelight would change everything. 3 nights after the rescue, a local volunteer was making rounds, checking in on survivors, and handing out food. When she stepped into Jerome's damaged trailer, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. There was Jerome, sitting on the floor next to an old mattress. Across from him was Miss Lillian, bundled up in a blanket. The two were quietly sharing a bowl of soup, candlelight flickering between them, shadows dancing on the walls. The storm had taken so much from them, yet the scene radiated warmth, peace, and a sense of something deeply human. Without interrupting, the volunteer gently raised her phone and snapped a photo. She later posted it on social media with a simple caption, "This man saved her during Hurricane Michael. Now he's her only family." Within hours, the photo started making waves. By the next morning, it had gone viral. People across the country and even around the world were sharing it. They weren't just moved by the storm or the rescue. They were moved by the story within the image. A young black man who risked his life for an elderly white woman and then cared for her like family. In a world often divided by race, age, and suspicion, this photo cut through the noise. It spoke of humanity, of compassion without conditions. It shattered stereotypes and left people speechless. This is what a real man looks like. We need more Jeromes in the world. I cried reading this. Thank you for restoring my faith in people. Thousands of comments poured in from all corners of the globe. Artists started painting the photo. Churches shared it during sermons. Celebrities retweeted it. TV hosts mentioned it during broadcasts. Hashtags like #RealHero and #Jerome the Rescuer began trending. News crews rushed to find Jerome. When they finally did, he was still in his trailer, unaware of the storm he had created, not the hurricane, but the wave of love and admiration building around him. When a reporter told him the photo had been seen by over 5 million people, Jerome's eyes widened. 5 million? Nah, you're joking. I was just doing what felt right. The attention didn't stop there. A group of strangers, touched by his humility, started a GoFundMe page on his behalf. In just 72 hours, it raised over $85,000. But Jerome didn't even know it existed until someone from a Red Cross told him. When asked what he'd do with the money, Jerome said, "Fix the roof first, then maybe finally go back to school. I always wanted to get my degree." Miss Lillian, hearing this, squeezed his hand and smiled. "You deserve the world, baby. You gave me mine back." The photo had not only captured a moment, it had captured the spirit of what humanity is supposed to be. It reminded everyone that kindness isn't about color or background, it's about choice. And Jerome had chosen, without a second thought, to love a stranger like his own kin. But what neither Jerome nor Miss Lillian knew was that someone else had seen the photo too. Someone very important. And that one viewer was about to make a phone call. A call that would turn Jerome's world upside down for the better. Just 3 days after the storm, while Jerome was sweeping water out of his front steps with a broken broom, his phone, miraculously still working, started to ring. He didn't recognize the number. It had a New York area code. He almost ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. But something told him to answer. "Hello." There was a pause. Then, the voice on the other end trembled. "Is this Jerome Thompson? The man who saved my mother?" Jerome furrowed his brow. Yes, who's this?" "This is David Carter, Lillian Carter's son." Jerome stood still, blinking in disbelief. David explained that he and his mother had lost touch years ago. A falling out over life choices, pride, distance, too many things unsaid and never fixed. He hadn't spoken to her in over a decade. He didn't even know if she still lived in Florida. Then, one morning, scrolling through social media, he saw that photo. There was his mother, frail, elderly, but alive, holding hands with a stranger in the glow of candlelight. And that stranger was the man who had just answered his call. "I cried like a baby," David admitted. "I thought I had lost her forever." Without wasting time, David booked the first available flight from New York to Florida. Within 24 hours, he was standing on Jerome's front porch. No cameras, no reporters, just two men meeting over a shared act of fate. The moment they saw each other, David didn't say a word. He just wrapped Jerome in a hug, tight, long, and emotional. "You didn't just save my mom," he said, choking back tears. "You brought my family back together." That moment was more than thanks. It was the beginning of something new. David stayed for several days, helping Jerome clean up storm damage and spending time with Miss Lillian, now healthy and smiling more than she had in years. The bond that had been broken was slowly mending, and at the heart of it was Jerome. David, a successful tech entrepreneur who had built his business from scratch in New York City, saw something in Jerome that went beyond bravery. He saw potential, leadership, heart, and he decided to act. One evening, as they sat on the porch drinking instant coffee from cracked mugs, David turned to Jerome and said, "I want to offer you something, a job, at my company, full time. Come to New York. Let me help you get back on your feet." Jerome was stunned. "Me? I've only worked construction. I don't know anything about tech." David smiled. "You've got something we can't teach, integrity. Skills can be learned. Heart can't." But it didn't end there. David also pledged to pay for Jerome's college tuition, telling him, "Whatever dream you put on hold, it's time to pick it back up." Jerome sat in silence, overwhelmed. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, dropped out of college to support his family, and had long buried the hope of ever going back to school. Now, because of one selfless act during a hurricane, doors were opening he never imagined. Before leaving, David pulled him aside and said, "The world doesn't need more billionaires. It needs more Jeromes. You changed my mother's life. Let me help change yours." That phone call, that visit, that moment of recognition, it transformed Jerome's path completely. But through it all, he remained grounded. He kept repeating to those who praised him, "I didn't do anything special. I just did what felt right." Today, Jerome Thompson's life looks very different from the storm-drenched trailer he once called home. He now lives in New York City, a place he had only seen on TV before that fateful week. The lights, the rush, the endless noise, it was overwhelming at first. But Jerome adapted, because after walking through a hurricane, nothing really scares you anymore. Thanks to the support of David Carter, Miss Lillian's son, Jerome is now enrolled at a local university, finishing his degree in social work, a dream he had buried under years of bills, labor jobs, and broken opportunities. But today, that dream is alive and thriving. I want to help people who feel forgotten, Jerome says, because I know what it feels like. On weekends, he volunteers with a disaster relief group, often heading into towns recovering from floods, fires, or tornadoes. He doesn't go there for praise. He goes because he's been there. He's lived through the fear, the uncertainty, the darkness, and he knows that sometimes all it takes is one person showing up to make someone feel seen. But despite his busy life, there's one thing he never forgets: his weekly call with Miss Lillian. Even now, years later, they still talk every Sunday. Sometimes it's a short chat, just checking in. Other times they reminisce, laugh, cry, or sit in silence on the phone, grateful for the connection that nature's worst couldn't destroy. She became family, Jerome says softly. Storms don't just destroy, they reveal what's really in people's hearts. That simple truth, born in the eye of a hurricane, has guided Jerome ever since. People often stop him on the street now, recognizing him from that viral photo. Some ask for a selfie, others just want to say thank you. But Jerome doesn't see himself as a hero. I wasn't trying to be anyone's inspiration, he says. I was just trying to help a neighbor. That's what we're supposed to do. And maybe that's why his story resonates so deeply. Because in a world that too often rewards loudness over kindness, Jerome's quiet courage cut through like a lighthouse in the storm. He showed us that heroism doesn't wear a cape. It wears muddy boots. It walks through floodwaters with shaking arms, carrying someone else's grandmother. It gives up the last blanket. It stays behind when others run. Jerome's legacy isn't just what he did, it's what he inspired in others. After his story went viral, hundreds of people reached out to share their own moments of kindness. Stories of strangers being rescued, neighbors helping neighbors, and communities rebuilding from the ground up. His actions reminded the world of something essential: that you don't have to be rich or famous to make a difference. You just have to care and act. Miss Lillian is now living with her son in a quiet neighborhood just outside New York. She has a small garden, some new friends, and a photo of her and Jerome framed beside her bed. She says she looks at it every morning to remind herself that good people still exist. So, the next time disaster strikes, whether it's a storm, a crisis, or a moment of fear, you might find yourself with a choice. Will you be the one who runs or the one who rescues? Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't made in the spotlight. They're made in the dark, in the rain, with nothing but a heartbeat, a choice, and a man who simply said, "That could have been my grandma." Even as the world moved on from Hurricane Michael and its devastation faded from headlines, Jerome's story refused to be forgotten. It didn't just trend, it transformed. His name became synonymous with quiet heroism, and people everywhere began asking, what would I do in a moment like his? That question alone was proof that his actions reached far beyond Miss Lillian's front porch. High schools started sharing his story in classrooms, not just to talk about disaster response, but to teach character. Teachers showed the candlelight photo and asked their students, what does courage look like to you? In churches and community centers, Jerome became a symbol of modern-day grace. In an era filled with division, his story reminded people that love still breaks through when it matters most. Jerome started receiving letters, hundreds of them, from children who said they wanted to grow up to be helpers like him, from elderly people who had lost hope in humanity, but said his actions helped them believe again, from inmates, veterans, single mothers, teachers, people from all walks of life, each touched by the reminder that one selfless act can ripple outward like a wave. One letter, in particular, stood out to Jerome. It came from a 12-year-old girl in Alabama who wrote, "My daddy left when I was little, and I used to think men couldn't be kind. But now I want to believe they can. Thank you for being brave. Jerome cried reading that one. He realized then that he hadn't just saved one life, he had quietly restored something even deeper, a sense of trust, of shared humanity, of what it means to be there for someone with no expectation of reward. And it didn't stop there. A small publishing house approached Jerome about writing a children's book inspired by his rescue of Miss Lillian. He hesitated at first. He was never the public speaker type, but eventually he agreed on one condition: that the book would be free for schools and libraries in low-income areas. The book, titled The Man Who Stayed Behind, was released a year later and became a favorite among teachers and parents alike. Illustrated simply, yet powerfully, it told the story not just of the storm, but of a man's decision to care when it would have been easier not to. And still, Jerome stayed humble. He didn't buy a flashy car. He didn't move into a penthouse. He kept things simple: a small apartment, a stack of books, a few framed photos, one of his mom, one of him and Miss Lillian, and one of the day he graduated with his associate degree in human services. He still volunteers, still checks on his neighbors, and still shows up when no one's watching. The camera flash dies. The news cycle moves on, but kindness? That sticks with you, he once told a group of college students during a guest lecture. He doesn't call himself a hero, but others do. And rightly so, because when the world shook, when the waters rose, and when everything familiar fell apart, Jerome didn't just rescue a neighbor. He rescued the belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things simply by choosing to care. So, the next time you're scrolling through your feed and see another disaster, another tragedy, another cry for help, pause for a second, think of Jerome, and ask yourself, what could you do with the little you have to change someone's world? Because sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't built in headlines. It's built in the quiet moments when no one's watching but someone is hurting and you choose to step in.